This is Algebra 2, Chapter 5, Unit 5. Solving polynomial equations by factoring. Steps to solving polynomial equations by factoring are: first, move all terms to one side and set the equation equal to 0. Next, factor the polynomial completely. And last, set each factor equal to 0 and solve for each x value. For quadratic equations, solve by square roots, completing the square, or the quadratic formula. Simplify all irrational and complex solutions. Now let's look at some examples. Our first example is x cubed plus x equals 0. We want to factor this binomial. So we're looking for the greatest common factor between both terms. In this case, we have a variable of x here and a variable x here. So therefore, we can factor out 1x. When we factor out the x, we are left with x squared plus 1. Next, we want to set each side equal to 0. So I'm going to go ahead and create a t-chart where I can easily identify and set each term equal to 0. Next, I set each term equal to 0, so I have x equals 0 and x squared plus 1 equals 0. Well, this one is already done because x is solved. So now I have to solve this x squared plus 1 equals 0. So I go ahead and subtract 1 from both sides, and I'm left with x squared equals negative 1. Then I go ahead and I take the square root of x squared and the square root of negative 1, and notice that we have the square root of negative 1, so we're going to have to get rid of that negative sign. So that's just going to become an I. The square root of negative 1, remember, is an I, or an imaginary number. And now we have the square root of x squared. Well, that's just simply x. So we have x equals plus or minus I. So our solution set is going to be plus or minus I and 0. Our next example is 5x to the 5th power minus 80x. In this, we can tell that we can take both sides and factor out a 5. Next, we look at our variables and see if each term has any in common. And they both do, so we can factor out an x from both. So we factor out 5x. Take 5x to the 5th power divided by 5x. Well, 5 divided by 5 is 1. X to the 5th divided by x, well, 1 cancels out, so we're left with x to the 4th. And then we have negative 80 divided by 5, well, that's 16, and these x's cancel out. So we're left with 5x and x to the 4th minus 16. But we're not done there yet, because both of these are, we can reduce even further. So we still carry down our 5x. And to simplify, we take x4 and minus 16. Well, if we go ahead and divide both those, take the square root of both of those, we're left with x squared and 4. So, I apologize, this should be negative 4 right here, negative 4. So we're left with a positive 4 and a negative 4, and these cancel out the middle term, so 4 and negative 4 multiplied together equals negative 16. Well, here we go, we break it down even further. This x squared plus 4, well, that is already prime. That can't be factored any further, so we're going to leave that alone. And we have x squared and negative 4. Well, if we have x plus 2 and x minus 2, that would equal positive 4, and that middle term, that x term, would not be there because these two signs are opposite, so it would cancel out that middle term. Next, we set each one of these equal to 0. So I go ahead and I draw my chart. And I have 5x equals 0, x squared plus 4 equals 0, x plus 2 equals 0, and x minus 2 equals 0. And I go ahead and I solve for each one of those. My first one I'm going to solve for is 5x equals 0. So I'm going to take 0 and divide it by 5, which I would be left with 0. Next, on this one, x squared plus 4 equals 0, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides. I'm left with x squared equals negative 4. Over here, I have x plus 2 equals 0, so I'm going to go ahead and subtract 2 from both sides, and I'm left with x equals negative 2. Then I have x minus 2 equals 0. I'm going to go ahead and solve for x by adding 2 to both sides, and I'm left with x equals 2. So I have 3 of the terms done because my x equals something. But I still have this x squared. It's not simplified yet, so I'm going to have to go ahead and take the square root of both sides, since these are both perfect squares, and solve it. Once I take the square root, well, the square root of x squared is simply x, and I have the square root of negative 4. Well, from earlier chapter, we really don't like those negative signs under square root, so we're going to go ahead and factor out or change it into the square root of negative 1 and the square root of 4. Well, that negative 1 becomes an I, and that square root of 4 is 2, so we're going to have 2i. So x equals plus or minus 2i. And here is our solution set. We have x equals 0, plus or minus 2i, and plus or minus 2, because we have both a negative and a positive 2 as our solution. Now, will you try numbers 2, 3, and 5 through 10 on your own? Here are the answers for those problems. Go ahead and pause the video while you work out those problems and make sure you get the correct answers. Now let's look at another example. We have 2x to the 6th power minus 10x to the 4th minus 48x squared. So first we're looking for anything that we can factor out. Well, all of these are even numbers, so we know that we can factor out a 2. Next, we're looking at our variables. Can we factor out a variable? Well, yes. There is a common variable in all 3 terms, and that in this case is x. And we can factor out an x squared because that's our lowest x value. So we can factor out an 2x squared. When we do that, we take 2x to the 6th divided by 2x squared. Well, 2's cancel out or equal 1. And we have x to the 6th and x to x squared. Well, 6 minus 2 is 4. Next, we have negative 10 divided by 2 equals negative 5. X to the 4th divided by x squared. Well, 4 minus 2 equals 2, so we're left with 5x squared. And last, we have negative 48 divided by 2. Well, negative 48 divided by 2 is negative 24, and these x squared, they both cancel out. Are we done there yet? No? There? No. We're not quite done yet because we can reduce this even further. We know that we're looking at common factors of 24 that when added together will equal negative 5. In this case, that's going to be negative 8 and positive 3. So when you take negative 8 times 3, you get negative 24. And when you take negative 8 plus 3, you get negative 5. So we still have our 2x squared. We have our x squared minus 8. And we have our x squared plus 3. And we want to see if we can factor these numbers further anyway. And we can't. So we go ahead and draw our chart, separate it out so we can set each one equal to 0. So I have 2x squared equals 0, x squared minus 8 equals 0, and x squared plus 3 equals 0. I'm going to go ahead and solve for x on both sides. So the first one I'm going to do is the 2x squared equals 0, and I'm going to go ahead and divide it by both sides by 2. Then I'm left with x squared equals 0. Next, I have x squared minus 8 equals 0. I'm going to go ahead and add 8 to both sides, and I'm left with x squared equals 8. Same thing as we did previously, x squared plus 3 equals 0. Go ahead and subtract 3 from both sides, and I'm left with x squared equals negative 3. So I want to next, I have x squared, so I want to solve for x only. So I have to take the square root of each of these to solve for x. So when I do that, I have x equals 0 over here. Then I take the square root of x squared and the square root of 8. And I am left with, excuse me. Then I am left with the square root of 4 and the square root of 2, because 4 times 2 equals 8, so it becomes 2 times the square root of 2. Then I have the square root of x squared equals the square root of -3, and I go ahead and factor out that square root of -1, and I'm left with I, the square root of 3. So those are my answers. So then here is my solution set. I have 0 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 2 plus or minus I, the square root of 3. Now do numbers 11, 13 through 16 on your own. Go ahead and pause the video while you work those problems out. Here are the answers for those problems. Go ahead and pause it while you write down the answers. Now I would like you to complete homework number 5 on your own. Thank you.